Time for us to go ahead and get started in our Bible class this morning. If you'll grab your Bibles, you can open up to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. That'll be the source of our study this morning. Today's class number 18 of our study through the Epistle to the Hebrews. And we are moving into a portion of the book that is very heavily oriented towards application. In last week's class, we did study verses 19 through 25 of chapter 10, where the author started to make this transition away from the very theologically dense sections of the book, chapters 8 through the first half of 10, that we've been stuck in for over a month now, and into a portion that is, like I said, very directed towards application and telling Christians how they should live with Christ as their high priest. Before we get into new material today, let's review some of the major points from last week's class in verses 19 through 25 that'll set us up for understanding the new applications that we'll see in our new material. In verses 19 through 21 of Hebrews chapter 10, we read an abbreviated summary of the major conclusions that had come out of the multi-chapter discussion of Christ's priesthood that began back in chapter 8. These verses presented two specially curated facts that are important because they both inspire and they allow for all the application that is to come. So in verse 19, what was the first thing, the first fact that both inspires and allows for Christian application? Sorry? We have this confidence to enter the heavenly places. That's right. We also described it as a right to enter those places. And so we have this ability that is bought for us by the blood and the sacrifice of Christ to go where people of the old covenant could not go. All throughout Hebrews, the author has brought up all of this importance of entering the holy places. The old covenant people couldn't do it as much as they might desire to. And it's extremely important that we now have the right to enter such sacred ground, knowing that we belong there. And what two things let us know that we belong in the holy places? What does the author say kind of guarantees us this access? Okay, so there's the sacrificial blood of Jesus. That's right. What else? Before having the high priest, and part of the new way is the incarnate flesh of Jesus. He is the new and living way by which we enter the heavenly places. So it's both Jesus' body and his blood that are the cleansing atonement by which we are made pure enough to enter the holy places, but it's also the literal pathway. He is the way by which we get to God's presence. The point being that Jesus is completely sufficient as both the means of cleansing and the means of entrance into the holy places. Now, in verse 21, this is where the author presents the second facet or fact that allows for Christian application. And what is that? Now we have a great priest presiding in the house of God. And it's not only Christ who we find in the holy places. What is the house of God? It is the church. We remember back from chapter 3, the house of God is his people. And we can be part of that people if we hold firm our confidence to the end. So we enter the holy places to dwell with the church and Christ as our priest. And this allows Christians to live differently, to apply things that no one in history could apply. Because of the great blessings we've received in our high priest and in our community, we are able to make application. We're able to change our lives. Verses 22 through 25 then gave us three summary statements of the broad groups of application that are going to be explored throughout the rest of the book. And this was given to us as three let us statements. So, in verse 22, since Christians have the right to enter the holy places, what should they do? They should enter the holy places. That's right. We are expected to avail ourselves of the benefits provided by our high priest. And what quality should come along with us? What should describe us as we enter the holy places? So there's confidence and boldness from the prior section. I'm looking more for this sincereness of heart. This is the holiness or the sanctity that we see usually brought up alongside with entering the presence of the Lord throughout all of the Old Testament and throughout the book of Hebrews up to this point. The author expresses this holiness and sanctification by means of our hearts, describing the Christian heart as one that is true and has been sprinkled clean. But we'll see a lot about entering God's presence with holiness throughout the next 3.5 chapters. All right, the second let us statement was in verse 23. Once Christians are made holy and they enter the holy places, what should they do there? They should hold fast. They should remain. This is the broad category of endurance that we have been emphasizing all throughout the book. And the relationship to endurance to God's faithfulness is going to become particularly important at the end of chapter 10 and, of course, throughout chapter 11 and 12. The third let us statement was found in verse 24. While Christians are holding fast within the holy places, what else should they be doing? They should be helping others to hold fast at the same time. Again, already back in chapter 3, we've talked about this idea that salvation is a community effort. It takes a village to make it to heaven. So our gatherings, our encouragements, and our actions must all work together to help others endure. And what is our endurance oriented towards? Specifically, our communal endurance there in verse 25. It all is oriented towards one central facet. What is that? So encouraging each other is what you do while you are enduring, but what is your encouraging each other pointed towards? Perseverance. Sorry? Perseverance. So persevering is still, that's part of the enduring. What are you persevering for? The day that is coming. That's right. That's what has to be on your mind during all of your encouragements of one another, your enduring together, and your persevering together. You are looking to that day that is approaching. We saw in chapter 9 that Jesus is coming back, not to make another sacrifice for sins, but he's coming back to both bring his redeemed home and then also to judge those who are wicked on earth. Today's class is really going to double down on this topic of judgment and how that should affect our communal interactions, how that should affect our vision of one another, how we talk to one another, and how we think of one another. And we're going to find that the author returns to one of his favorite themes, which doesn't tend to be one of our favorite themes, and that's fear, the ominous, dreadful aspect of God's coming judgment. Fear is supposed to be one of the motivations that inspires how we interact with each other, but that's not the only thing that we are supposed to think about in the day that is approaching. There's also hopeful expectation. And in today's class, we're going to see the author use both fearful expectation and hopeful expectation to tell us how we should interact with one another. So, let's go ahead and start into our new material this morning in verse 26 of Hebrews chapter 10, where we dive into the fearful side of the argument. So, Hebrews chapter 10, starting in verse 26. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment, and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment, do you think, will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God, has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and has outraged the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," and again the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. These verses are intense, and they're obviously oriented towards fear and other unpleasant topics. And so to make sure that we don't get too carried away by the intensity of this language, I think it's helpful to approach this passage with 3 questions. First, what is the sinning that we're talking about in verse 26? Second, what are the results that come from this sinning? And third, what is our reaction to both this sin and the results. So let's start by investigating what is the sin of verse 26. Read through this passage again and tell me, what characteristics describe the sinning of this passage? What do you see in the text? Okay, so there's a willful, deliberate, non-accidental aspect. What about before that? Sorry? Mine has go on sinning, so there is a persistence that is implied with it. Okay? What else do you see in this text? We know it's persistent and deliberate. Okay, so it is informed. There's no excuse for ignorance here. People know something already. That's right.
There's no sacrifice for sins if you all think it's
So we'll get to the sacrifice aspect. I'm going to group that under results rather than describing the sin itself, but that's very closely related. What about in verse 28? What is it compared to? So we know that it is analogous to setting aside the law of Moses. This helps us a lot in clarifying what kind of sinning we're discussing here. It has a direct comparison that we can imagine alongside with it. What about in verse 29? How's it described? Okay, this is where we get the really dramatic language. It is trampling underfoot the Son of God. What else are you doing to him? You are, regarding as unclean, profaning his blood. You are making something that has been described as sacred throughout 3.5 chapters of Hebrews as common, as nothing of value. And then the last aspect, description of this sin. You insult or outrage the Spirit of grace. This should make us think of other sins against the Spirit that have been that are talked about in the Gospels, which have similar descriptions of judgment as well. But what we should at least know from this is that it outrages God. It outrages God for this type of sinning to continue. So it's persistent, deliberate, it's informed, it is analogous to setting aside the law of Moses, and then it's heinous to the extreme. It is trampling the Son of God, making him common, and making him outraged. It is my opinion, and I think most commentators' opinions as well, that verses 28 and 29 in particular leave little doubt that this sin is anything less than rebellion against God. Or as we would call it in church speak, this is going to be apostasy, or this is going to be falling away. The analogy there in verse 28 of setting aside the law of Moses implies that the new sinner who is under the law of Christ is performing a similar action. It would be setting aside the new and superior law of Jesus. Verse 29 is also very interesting because you might notice that it tries to reverse a lot of the roles that we read about back in verse 13. What's happening back in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 13? What is Jesus doing in that verse? He's waiting for what? He's waiting for his enemies to be put under his feet. And now here later in chapter 10 and verse 29, it's his enemies who are attempting to turn the tables. They say, no, we are going to be on top. We will trample the Son of God under our feet. Further, they are trying to remove the sanctity of Jesus' blood. They're trying to make it common, like the blood of bulls and goats that we just spent so long talking about how inefficacious it was. And then they are also outraging the Spirit. The very helper by which Christ sends us his grace is the one that they are disgracing or the one that they are outraging. All of these descriptions, I think, should remind us of a passage that we looked at way back in class 3, which actually comes from the very first Old Testament quotation in the book of Hebrews, and that's Psalm 2. You might remember Psalm 2. It's where we have the Son of God presented for the first time as his anointed one. And this is a passage of wrath, if I can put it that way. It is all about how the leaders or the kings of the earth are seeking to rebel. They're trying to become on top of the totem pole. They're trying to put the anointed one underneath their feet. And what's the result of all of those rebellious kings in Psalm 2? Does anyone remember the description we received there? Shattered. They will be shattered with a rod of iron. They will be dashed to pieces. Here in Hebrews 10, we get a similar description of God's response to rebellion. How does the author describe the results of apostasy during these verses that we just read? Okay, so we know that there is a terror that comes along with it as one of the results, and that you will fall into the hands of the living God. So that kind of combines verses 27 and 31. Okay, so the vengeance of the Lord as well. In verse 26, what is the first result of this apostasy? There's no more sacrifice remaining for your sins. You have been removed from the sacrificial cleansing of the Son. In verse 27, we find that one of the results is an expectation of judgment and fury. What about in verses 28 and 29? How is the response, God's response to this apostasy described in those verses? Okay, die without mercy is for the law of Moses. How is it described for this apostasy under the law of Christ? It is much worse than that which you suffered under the law of Moses. And then in verse 31, we see it is to fall into the hands of the living God. That first result in verse 26 of no longer having a sacrifice for sins should remind us of what we just read a few verses earlier in verse 18 of Hebrews chapter 10. In that passage, the author states, where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer any offering for sin. And when we covered that passage, we emphasized the complete sufficiency of the offering of Christ. Now we see that it has a uniqueness that his uniqueness has a result that perhaps we didn't consider at that point. It cuts both ways. There is an exclusivity to the offering of Jesus that means nothing else can purify, forgive, or serve as the entryway to God's presence. So the deliberate sin of verse 26 should be understood as a regression where one has removed themselves from the sacrifice of Jesus and they no longer have any hope of salvation. Like the rebel kings of Psalm 2, they have cast aside their only hope, and so what expectation remains for them at this point? In verse 27. Judgment is what I read in the first part of 27, and in the latter half, fury. And how is that fury described for us? It's somewhat extreme. It is a fire that will consume the adversaries. We'll talk about the fiery language in just a second, but first I want to draw your attention to how these people are described here. I believe the author is writing to those who have been Christians, who have received the knowledge of the truth, and now they have been transformed. They are no longer described as Christ's siblings, as we've seen in other passages. They're now described as adversaries, as opponents to the Lord. And opponents find this fiery, burning wrath. This wrath burning like fire also comes from Psalm 2, but it seems here that the author is quoting more directly from Isaiah. In Isaiah 26, God actually gives Isaiah a hymn that he says his people will sing someday. After their restoration, after the new covenant, his people are going to sing this hymn. In Isaiah 26:11, the hymn includes, O Lord, your hand is lifted up, but the wicked do not see it. Let them see your zeal for your people and be ashamed. Let the fire for your adversaries consume them. That same imagery returns again later in the book of Isaiah in chapter 33, and it shows that it's not just the Babylonians or the external enemies of God's people that are going to be consumed, but even his own covenant people who should know better. Isaiah 33:14, we read, the sinners in Zion are afraid. Trembling has seized the godless. Who among us can dwell with the consuming fire? Who among us can dwell with everlasting burnings? The author makes a very similar point in Hebrews 10 with his traditional argument from lesser to greater. If apostatizing under the law of Moses merited death, then a much worse fate, a much greater punishment than death awaits those who rebel against the law of Christ. So if you thought things were bad for the Exodus generation who all fell by the wayside and didn't get to enter the land, or if you thought things were bad for the victims of Babylon during the siege of Jerusalem, then you can't imagine the just vengeance that comes upon those who have rebelled against God's Son. Apostate Christians won't just fall into the hands of 2 or 3 witnesses. They won't just fall into the hands of the Babylonians. They fall into the hands of the living God. And this brings us to some tough applications. These verses don't contain any direct commands. We'll get to those in the verses we're coming to later. But I think we should make some applications by asking a few questions about this apostasy and about our response to the horrible sin of apostasy and its dreadful results. The first response that I'd like to argue that we should have towards apostasy should be faith. Look with me again at verse 30. What does the author say that we know in that verse? We know him, meaning God or perhaps Christ here. And what else do we know? We know what he has said. We know his words, or if I can phrase it another way, we know his promises. Already back in verse 23, what relationship do we learn exists between God and his promises? He is faithful to keep his promises. The 2 particular promises that we have in mind here come from Deuteronomy 32. This is going to be Moses' closing song to the long exhortation that is the book of Deuteronomy. He's telling the Israelites to have faith, to have perseverance, and to not be like their parents, to not suffer the same destruction that his parents suffered. The author now uses these same words to say God has promised. God has promised vengeance among those who rebel against him. He has promised destruction for those who disobey. We should have faith that God is going to keep his promises. And this should encourage us to persevere through earthly trials and be better than that Exodus generation. Now, having faith that God will keep his promises, even his promises of vengeance, can be tough. Often it's far easier to believe in a God who keeps his promises of reward than it is to believe in a God who keeps his promises of destruction. And this faith is complicated by the fact that this is often a very close to home subject. I'll try and be delicate throughout the rest of this because we have people here whose children have fallen away, who though they tried their best to raise them right, their children have fallen away. They lost their sacrifice for sins. We have siblings who, though they were raised like us, they have set aside the law of Christ. We have parents, we have grandparents who we used to look up to as heroes in the faith, who have now profaned the blood of God's covenant by which they were once sanctified. And the nearness of this issue to our hearts, to our homes, and to our church brings me to a second question. Do we minimize the evil of apostasy? And this minimization on the exterior probably looks like a over-softening of language. And sometimes when people apostatize or even publicly renounce Christ in a non-quiet way, we tend to speak very graciously towards them. And I think this comes out of good intentions. We don't want to overstep our judicial boundaries. We don't want to sow excess hurt or discord where there is already a rift in relationships. So these intentions are not misplaced, but we have to be careful. We can't allow them to overly soften our language and especially our thoughts when it comes to the seriousness of the sin of apostasy. What starts as softened language and good intentions can lead to dishonesty. where we lie to our families, we lie to our congregation, we lie to ourselves about just how evil apostasy is. It's the same as walking all over Christ. It's the same as spilling his blood for nothing. It is the same as outraging God. So we cannot seek to make judgments of others or take vengeance on the Lord's behalf, but we should be sure. We should seek to make sure that the evil of falling away is expressed accurately in our thoughts and in our language. Third application. The somber nature of apostasy is not something we should only think of in reference to others or those who have already fallen away. This whole passage is written to Christians who need to spend time considering themselves and what will happen to them should they fall away. And once we become Christians, our relationship with fear of hell does change, but we should never lose sight of the intensity of God's justice and the intensity of his vengeance. It is for Christians that the author wrote these strong words of warning. We too should live with personal consideration of the terrible punishment for apostasy if we fall away. And finally, the knowledge that apostasy is a heinous evil that reaches even to Christians like ourselves should shape the way that we view and interact with one another. This has already been talked about all the way back in Hebrews 3. I'll read you a couple of verses there. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. It is this theme of a daily communal exhortation that we must have towards one another in light of the fact that we could fall away, and what a terrible thing that would be, that the author continues on to next in Hebrews chapter 10. So let's go ahead now and jump forward to verse 32 of Hebrews 10 and read a few more verses. But recall the former days, when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. So we don't know much about the history or the background of the original audience of Hebrews, but this passage does reveal a few neat facts for us. First, we can tell from this passage the current trial and persecutions that these Christians seem to be suffering under, it's not their first rodeo. They've been through something like this before. Already in some former days, after their conversion, so after they become Christians, they have suffered and had difficult struggles. What do we know about their former struggles from this passage in particular? What do we learn? Okay, so they endured them, that's right. So we know that there was a damage to property in verse 34, or a seizure of property. What else? So in verse 33, it involved a public reproach and affliction. What else does it involve? In verse 34, again, we see that it involves imprisonment of at least some. What else do we know about their suffering from maybe outside this passage? Can anyone read my mind on this? In chapter 12, verse 4, we know that it did not involve martyrdom. No one up to this point in this church's or this congregation's history seems to have had their blood shed for the name of Christ. A lot of commentators use this kind of combined description of the past history of this group to try and piece together both the location and the date for the original writing and audience of Hebrews. And it's somewhat valuable. This list does probably rule out Jerusalem or Judea as the home of the original audience. As we know, those groups saw death and bloodshed immediately after their conversion. So that would leave very little time. We're talking months or weeks for the letter to the Hebrews to be written if it was intended towards those groups. It also does seem to perhaps indicate some of the historical troubles that we know happened in Rome in the early 1st century, or maybe the mid-1st century, but before the major persecutions that we see where Christians were put to death. But I would say the author's point here is probably a little less about what they have suffered or when they suffered it, as it is about their response, about how they reacted to these past challenges. So how did they react? In verse 32, we see they endured. Okay, so in verse 34, they had compassion or sympathy on others, and they also were joyfully accepting loss. In verse 33, we see that they have partnered together, or they are sharing with others who are suffering. This passage in particular highlights what the author expects from his audience in all of those prior passages that we have studied that talked about communal exhortation. And all of those other one another passages, like in Hebrews 3 and earlier in chapter 10, the author isn't just telling Christians to be nice to one another or to talk to one another about good works. He's telling them that he expects them to endure trials by partnering together, by sharing the suffering together, by having compassion and sympathy on others who are suffering, who perhaps they can't immediately join, and accepting loss as part of a community. Now, in this passage, sharing involves the particular application of being publicly reproached with others, even those who have been legally afflicted and are put in prison. And I'd encourage you to use this to inform your reading of a passage that we very, very briefly looked at last week. And that's the last one another passage from verses 24 and 25. I'll read those again now. Hebrews 10:24. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. This passage in verses 32 through 34 expands what we have had summarized for us back in verses 24 and 25. While the meeting together of verse 25 could certainly have an official sense, by which the author means the official meeting together of the church services, as we're going to have in 20 minutes, that certainly is not the only gathering of Christians that we might be tempted to neglect, and is not the gathering of Christians that he brings up next. As we see in verses 32 through 34, when these Christians used to meet together, it was for public reproach. It was for affliction, imprisonment, and it was for loss. The point is, Christians aren't only supposed to meet together when we have a safe place with like-minded people, guards watching the doors, but when we are being reproached, when we are publicly being afflicted, that is when we need the most encouragement to meet together. That is the stirring up to love and good works that the author has in mind back in verse 24. And we could perhaps stretch the application a little further by adopting some of the language from Matthew 25. Christians are supposed to meet with those who are hungry, thirsty, naked, sick, immigrating, or in prison. These hard times are exactly when it is most important to act in love and good works, when it is most important to still meet together, despite the shame, despite the suffering, and despite the loss. This is when it is most important to have communal exhortation. So, in all of our meetings and partnerships, there is again, particular bit of knowledge that it is oriented towards. The day that is approaching, the day that is drawing near. And how does the author describe this future day in verse 34 when he expands his language a bit more? How does he describe the day that is approaching? A better and lasting possession. He swaps from temporal language to make it more of a possession language, and that is almost certainly to contrast with the possessions that they have lost as part of their communal suffering on earth. I want to point out how he frames this statement to use some of the language that we've seen show up all throughout Hebrews really 7 through 10. Better and abiding. He seems to be purposely contrasting the future possessions with the inferior and temporary possessions of earth. Or if we can steal some of the language from earlier in the book, the shadowy possessions, the less than real possessions, the insubstantial possessions. There are truer things that are waiting for these Christians. There are realer things. There are things with substance. Now, as we'll see once we get into chapter 11 and through chapter 12, it's not just possessions that become realer and truer in the future. We're going to see that those who joyfully accept the loss of their earthly reputation, like these Christians did, they receive a truer, better, abiding commendation from the Lord himself. We see that those who accept the loss of their earthly homes, their earthly homelands, their earthly families, they receive a truer, abiding, heavenly home, a heavenly community. And it is by keeping our eyes on that future heavenly horizon that Christians can endure together, that we can go through all of these shadowy, insubstantial, earthly trials. I have a quick couple of points of application to make from this, but we're quickly running out of time, and so I'm just going to move through this quickly, and then we'll get into our last set of verses this morning. First, in verse 32, the author he tells his audience to recall their former days. This is meant to be a mode of encouragement, saying, you have persisted in the past. You have succeeded together in the past. You can do it again. You can do the same actions of love and good works that you used to do, and this is how you can make it through your current troubles. Unfortunately, I've known many Christians in my life who would have difficulty recalling former community challenges and triumphs because they have not remained a member of any community long enough to go through challenges and triumphs. Some of this is modern issues with our current means of transportation, maybe personalized ideologies, and some societal breakdown. It's not uncommon to see Christians engage in what's typically called church hopping. You can stay somewhere for a few years, and then when the annoyances inevitably arise, or you start to see what are true, real issues with that congregation, you don't have to deal with them. Who has to put up with annoyances? Who has to solve real problems when you can go 20 minutes down the road and you could be with another group for a few years, live in blissful ignorance, and not know the challenges that they are facing? It's questionable. If it's written to Rome, then they probably could go to other groups because we do know that they had multiple, and this letter might be written to multiple groups. But no matter whether they had the possibility to, I believe the point is that Christian relationships are meant to stick through thick and thin. We are meant to be together through hard times, to have successes together, so that later we can continue to face challenges. We're not a people who keep running away from each other and keep running away from our problems. We are a people who have stuck together through former sufferings, and so we can face future challenges together as well. And the second point of application that I want to make from this before we really have to move on is that the coming day of judgment is not just something you look forward to or fear as an individual. It is something that must be watched as a community. Both the fearful vengeance of God or the better and abiding possessions is something that relates to us as a congregation. Remember, it was as a community that the Exodus generation failed to persevere. It was as a community that they decided to rebel against God and turn back and head towards their former lands. Similarly, it is together as a community that we stir up love and good works. We become a cloud of witnesses that help each other to run the race of endurance that is set before us. It is as a community that we look forward to the coming reward. And it is on this topic of coming reward that we're going to very quickly end our class today. So if you will continue reading with me in Hebrews 10, starting in verse 35. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Next class, we're going to begin our study of Hebrews 11, which includes a discussion on the nature of faith. And by all accounts, these last 5 verses of Hebrews chapter 10 are kind of the preamble to Hebrews 11. They are maybe more a part of that chapter than they are of chapter 10. So we're going to talk about it some today, but we're also going to talk about it quite a bit in next week's class. Instead of focusing on faith as much today, I'd like to draw attention to a couple of the other terms that are emphasized in these verses. The first, in verse 35, is the author's description of the reward of communal endurance, which he calls a great reward. I'll very briefly mention this. Back in class number 6, we saw similar language about Christians looking forward to the reward of a promised land of rest. We made the point, it's not mercenary to desire a reward. It's not a transactional religion to want heaven or to want God's presence or to want a community of saints. These are natural. These are necessary. And perhaps we can even go so far as to say, God has designed us to want these things. So just as we should lean into our primitive fears that take us away from the wrath of God, in the same way we should lean into our primitive desires that drive us towards the rewards of God. And there's a few other terms that the author uses to describe these rewards in these verses. What other descriptions does he use throughout these verses? Okay, in verse 36, we find that the reward is synonymous with what God has promised. What else? In verse 38, mine has that the reward can also be described as God finding pleasure in us or God's approval of us. In verse 39, it is further described as the preservation of our souls. All of these verses kind of have parallel sentences which describe similar things, but perhaps shouldn't be viewed as exactly synonymous as much as they are concurrent with one another. The author seems to be listing these more for rhetorical effect than he is for specificity. So just understand that a lot of these will show up throughout chapter 11 and 12, but all of these describe the reward that we are looking to as Christians. All right, similarly in these verses, what are the various ways that the author describes the method by which we achieve this reward? What do you read? All right, so endurance, that's in verse 36. What about in verse 35, before that? Not throwing away our confidence, that's right. Okay. Okay, so that's holding fast as well. And in verses 38 and 39, what do we do there to achieve this reward? Okay, so you live by faith so that you're one who does not shrink back in verse 39. And in verse 38 has similar language. It's righteousness that comes from living by faith. You could probably just tell from the shift in the author's vocabulary through these verses that he's trying to funnel us towards a conversation about faith. And so we're going to end class today by addressing how faith relates to some of the prior chapters that we've been looking at. And this is revealed for us by how the author introduces faith with a quotation from Habakkuk 2. Now, Habakkuk 2, we're not going to turn there. It is probably a messianic prophecy which speaks about Christ's incarnation. He is the coming one. But the author of Hebrews also interprets the latter half of this prophecy as addressing all Christians. So not just Christ, but also all of his brothers and sisters. And how does Habakkuk describe God's new covenant people? We live by faith. I would say that's maybe more of a method, but the way that he actually describes us is we become righteous ones. We are righteous ones. And I think that this is key for connecting chapters 8 through 10 with chapters 11 through 13. Righteousness is what we spent 8 through 10 kind of talking about. We spent all of those chapters talking about how Jesus accomplishes the ability to make you righteous. It was by his sacrifice. It was by his perfect incarnation. He did all of that so he could make you sanctified, holy, to make you righteous. Now what we see is in this passage and then through chapters 11 and 12, is that one of the methods by which Jesus makes us righteous is by faith, specifically living by faith. So next week, as we dive into the nature and the contents of faith, I encourage you to please remember just a couple of things. First, living by faith is not an end unto itself. It is intended to make you righteous and therefore pleasing to God. We'll see this come up over and over again through especially the first half of chapter 11. And second, righteousness is enabled by Christ's priesthood. That means all of the applications of faith that we're going to cover over the next few weeks are rooted in the work of Christ as our priest. Now, as we close, I think I'm already over on time, but I haven't heard a bell. I have just a couple of announcements about what we're doing next week. First, the original schedule had us covering the priesthood of believers next week. I failed to account for how the gospel meeting that we have in September will break up chapter 12 in the current or in the original schedule. So the priesthood of believers has been moved to class 24, and everything in between has been shifted up. The handouts in the back reflect the change that I've made, and so we'll actually be moving into chapter 11 of Hebrews next week instead of our original schedule. So please grab one of those in the back and read ahead so that you can prepare for next week's class. And additionally, please start meditating on the topic of living by faith and give special consideration to how your definition of faith relates to both righteousness and relates to Christ's work as your high priest. All right. Thank you so much for your attention.